Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into some provocative territory, questions you've sent in that honestly might be a tough pill to swallow for, anyone invested in the world of Bitcoin.
Definitely tough questions.
Right. Like, is Bitcoin still that peer-to-peer global payment system it started out as? Or has it, like some sources claim, turned into something else? Maybe. Maybe just another Ponzi scheme built on hype.
That's the big one people ask, yeah.
And what about all the talk, the concerns about radical censorship, centralization creeping in? Is that 21 million coin limit actually set in stone? Or could more Bitcoin hypothetically be created out of thin air?
It challenges the core narrative, for sure.
Absolutely. And then there's this idea floating around, a government building a massive strategic Bitcoin reserve. Does that even make sense when you look at everything else?
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And these questions, they cut right to the heart of Bitcoin's identity, challenging assumptions many hold. So to help us figure this out, we've been digging into a couple of key sources.
What are we looking at?
First, excerpts from Roger Ver and Steve Patterson's book, Hijacking Bitcoin, The Hidden History of BTC. And second, an interview with Steve Patterson discussing that book and, well, Bitcoin's whole evolution with Catherine Austin Fitts.
Okay, so Ver's perspective, which is known to be quite critical of the direction BTC took.
Exactly. So our mission here is really to walk you through the arguments in these sources. We want to pull out the main points, the insights they're offering to help you understand this, let's say, alternative view on how Bitcoin changed. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. And to really get the critique these sources are making, we kind of have to rewind, go back to the start. The original promise of Bitcoin back in 2008.
Yeah, the white paper itself, right? Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It's right there, the name.
Couldn't be clearer. The sources really hammered this point. It was meant as digital cash. Peer-to-peer, no banks, no middlemen.
Global low fees, financial sovereignty. That was the dream, wasn't it?
That was the pitch. And the sources emphasize Satoshi wasn't thinking small. They point out, even in 2009, Satoshi was apparently talking about scaling Bitcoin to Visa levels.
Visa levels, wow. So handling huge volumes, millions of people using it daily.
That seems to be the original ambition laid out in the sources, yeah. A global payment network, cheap and fast.
Which just feels so different from the digital gold or store of value narrative we hear constantly today.
Exactly. And that gap, that divergence, is the absolute core of Roger Ver's argument in Hijacking Bitcoin.
So the book basically says Bitcoin got deliberately knocked off course.
That's the central thesis. It wasn't just like organic evolution. The book argues a small group of developers and, influencers actively pushed it away from being electronic cash.
Pushed towards what? Just being the speculative asset?
Towards being primarily a store of value, yeah. Digital gold. Less about sending money cheaply, more about holding it, hoping the price goes up.
Okay, but how? How did the sources say they pulled that off? What was the mechanism?
The big one they point to, again and again, is the block size limit, keeping it stuck at 1 megabyte.
That small limit that restricts how many transactions fit into each block.
Right. The sources stress this was meant to be temporary, like just a quick fix for spam in the very early days. But then it became this line in the sand, defended fiercely.
And the argument is that keeping it small was a strategic power play.
That's the claim in the book.
Yeah.
Because the direct result, which nobody really disputes, is
higher fees and slower transactions make sense.
Yeah.
If space is limited, you pay more to get in.
Exactly. Fees went from, tiny fractions of a cent to dollars, sometimes even hundreds, depending on how busy the network was, which just killed the idea of using it for small, everyday payments.
Or for people in developing countries needing cheap international transfers, which was supposedly a key goal.
Completely priced them out.
Yeah.
The sources argue this technical decision basically crippled Bitcoin's utility as actual cash.
And this whole fight led to the block size wars, right? That whole messy period.
Yeah, huge conflict, lots of drama. It all culminated in that 2017 hard fork.
Where Bitcoin Cash, BCH, split off.
Right. And the sources frame BCH as the attempt to, salvage that original vision. Low fees, fast payments. Roger Ver became a huge proponent of BCH for exactly that reason, according to the book. He saw it as the real Bitcoin, sticking to the plan.
Okay, so that's the block size argument. But the Patterson and Fitts interview brings in other concerns too, doesn't it? Like centralization and censorship.
It really doubles down on that. They echo the book, saying powerful centralized players started calling the shots, moving it away from decentralization.
Patterson's quote was pretty blunt, something about gatekeepers.
Yeah, he described it as a system where a few gatekeepers dictate the protocol's direction. Pretty strong words.
Do they give specific examples of this alleged control? Like actual censorship?
They do. One thing highlighted was control of the main online forums where Bitcoin was discussed for years, apparently owned by one pseudonymous person.
One person controlling the main discussion hubs.
Yeah, and the claim is they actively censored opposing views. People who criticized the, let's say, powerful figures or questioned the digital gold path, they got banned, silenced.
So controlling the narrative, not just the code.
Exactly. And they link this to the core developers themselves. Some key developers formed their own company, Blockstream.
Right, I've heard of Blockstream. They got significant funding.
Hundreds of millions, the sources say, from the traditional financial industry. And they offer their own blockchain, the Liquid Network, where Blockstream gets the fees.
So the argument is these developers, funded by finance, had an incentive not to scale the main Bitcoin chain, and they had the power to block changes.
That's the core of the allegation, that this concentration of power and funding gave them effectively veto power over things like increasing the block size. So even if the base code didn't change in some ways, preventing necessary changes fundamentally altered what Bitcoin could be used for.
Okay, this leads us straight into another huge question people asked about, that 21 million coin limit. Is it really unbreakable? Or could Bitcoin somehow be created from thin air? That hard cap is like the main selling point for so many.
It's presented as Bitcoin's defining feature, absolutely, the guarantee against inflation. But the sources throw some cold water on that certainty. They talk about something called the inflation bug.
An inflation bug. Seriously, tell me about that.
Okay, so according to the sources, this bug was accidentally introduced in a software update back in 2016 by a core developer named Matt Corello. It wasn't caught until 2018.
And discovered by
A developer working on Bitcoin Cash, actually, someone known as Amini.
Okay, and what could this bug have done? What was the danger?
This is where it gets, well, pretty alarming, according to these sources. They say this bug, if someone had found and exploited it, could have allowed for arbitrary inflation. Meaning creating new Bitcoin, just out of thin air, as many as you want. They call it the worst possible bug for Bitcoin, given its whole premise.
Wow. So it could have happened.
It could have. Now, it was disclosed privately and patched before it was exploited on the main network. That's crucial. But the sources argue the mere existence of such a bug proves the 21 million limit isn't some magical law of physics. It depends on perfect code and vigilant developers.
And didn't they mention another even earlier bug, one that was exploited?
Yeah, they briefly referenced one back in 2010. Billions of Bitcoin were apparently created instantly. It required a whole network rollback, a fork, to fix it.
So this idea of code is law and the 21 million cap being totally mutable, it sounds like the reality, according to these sources, is a bit more fragile.
That's exactly the point they're making, and it gets even more complicated. They mentioned Peter Todd, another well-known core developer, has actually suggested publicly that maybe the 21 million limit should be increased someday.
Wait, increase the limit? Why on earth would a core developer suggest that? Isn't that heresy?
Well, the reasoning presented in the sources relates to network security in the long run. You know how the block reward the new Bitcoin miners get keeps getting cut in half?
The halvings, right. Eventually it becomes tiny.
Exactly. The idea was that transaction fees would eventually take over and pay for network security. But if the block size is kept small, fees can only go so high in aggregate, even if individual fees are large. There's a cap on total fee revenue per block.
So if those fees aren't enough to incentivize miners to keep securing the network decades from now?
Then security could theoretically break down. So the suggestion Todd apparently floated, as reported by the sources, is maybe you do need a small permanent block reward forever, which means getting rid of the 21 million cap.
So it's technically possible to change it if everyone agreed.
Technically, yes. It would require broad consensus, a major shift. But the sources use this to underline that the 21 million cap isn't fundamentally untouchable. It's a social and technical consensus, not an immutable constant.
Okay, so if the utility as cash was hampered by the block size, pushing it toward speculation, and the hard cap isn't maybe as absolute as people think, this brings us right back to that really uncomfortable question you mentioned at the start. Is it, basically a Ponzi?
The sources address this directly. They're careful to say it's not a legal Ponzi scheme in the classic sense. But
But
But they argue its value has become overwhelmingly dependent on new money constantly flowing in from new buyers, because its utility for actual commerce is, they claim, limited by the high fees and slow speeds.
so people are buying mostly just because they expect the price to go up, hoping someone else will buy it for more later.
That's the dynamic they describe. They use the phrase spirit of a pyramid scheme, not that it is one legally, but the driving force is speculation on future buyers, not present-day utility. They also use that analogy of trading sardines.
Trading sardines.
Yeah, you know the old story. Two traders keep selling a can of sardines back and forth for higher and higher prices. Finally, one opens it, tries one, and says, "These are awful." The other replies, "Of course, those aren't for eating, they're for trading."
Ah, okay, so value driven purely by the expectation of resale, not intrinsic use.
Exactly. The sources argue Bitcoin's utility for eating for payments was suppressed, leaving only the trading aspect.
And do the sources get into how this speculative price might be, well, pushed up,
Mhm.
manipulated?
Oh, yeah. They point fingers. One major focus is Tether.
The stablecoin,
Yeah.
USDT.
Right. They call it crucial financial plumbing, but raise serious questions, the smoke around Tether, about whether it's really fully backed by cash reserves, as claimed.
And the concern is?
The concern raised is that Tether could potentially print USDT without full backing and use it to buy Bitcoin on exchanges, artificially inflating the price, pushing it up without real dollars necessarily entering the system proportionally.
That's a huge accusation. They frame Tether almost like a private central bank for crypto.
They frame it as a private issuer of dollars, but also suggest it's more complex, like a public-private partnership. They mention connections to U.S. agencies, FBI, Secret Service, involved in seizures. The sources paint Tether as potentially a tool for U.S. foreign policy, extending dollar dominance into crypto.
Wow, okay, heavy stuff. What about the ETFs, the Bitcoin ETFs that just got approved? Big mainstream moment,
A
right?
huge moment for accessibility, yeah. But the sources raise red flags there, too. They talk about enormous collateral shortages being possible.
Meaning the funds might sell more Bitcoin exposure than they actually hold, like paper Bitcoin.
That's the worry expressed, that buying an ETF share isn't the same as holding Bitcoin. You're buying, in their words, a bank IOU priced in Bitcoin.
Which is ironic because,
Because it brings back the exact counterparty risk and trust in institutions that Bitcoin was supposedly created to eliminate.
right, easy to click and buy, but you don't really hold the keys. And they mentioned something about the custodians. Who holds the actual Bitcoin for these ETFs?
Yeah, this was interesting. They note that for some major ETFs, like BlackRock's, the custodian is the same entity that handles the U.S. Department of Justice's asset forfeitures, the U.S. Marshals.
The U.S. Marshals.
Yes. And the sources add that this entity apparently can share and lease the assets they hold, which raises questions for them about control and potential rehypothecation of the underlying Bitcoin.
Okay, that feels like a direct line to the next big question. This idea of a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve. RFK Jr. proposed it, right? Does that make any sense in light of all these other concerns?
The sources are deeply skeptical, even hostile to this idea. RFK Jr.'s proposal was about the government buying up lots of Bitcoin for, quote, dominance. But the Patterson-Fitz interview outlines a potential funding mechanism that they find really disturbing.
How would the government pay for all that Bitcoin, not just taxes?
The mechanism they describe alleges it wouldn't be funded by typical tax revenue. Instead, it could involve essentially draining retirement funds.
Wait, draining pensions. How?
They suggest the New York Fed could tell primary dealer banks, they mention Cantor Fitzgerald, which they also link to Tether's backend, to sell treasury bonds to pension funds, state and corporate ones.
So pension funds buy treasury.
Right. That money flows to the Treasury. The Treasury then takes that cash and buys Bitcoin on the open market. The effect, the sources claim, would be to artificially pump the Bitcoin price to the moon, funded indirectly by retiree savings.
That sounds, well, the interview called it literally disgusting.
That was the phrase used, yeah. Using public or retiree money to inflate an asset price.
So the reserve isn't just about holding Bitcoin for its own sake. There's a bigger play.
According to these sources, absolutely. They connect it to a potential land grab. They point out the U.S. government sits on trillions in public land and resources, and they say schemes exist to monetize or privatize these assets. They mention seeing trial balloons, suggesting how this could work. Entities could sell Bitcoin into this government reserve at inflated prices, then take those massive profits and roll them tax-free into real estate using loopholes like 10,031 exchanges.
So use the pumped-up Bitcoin price, fueled by retiree savings, to cash out and buy up real assets.
That's the scenario they described, making generational fortunes by, as they put it, plundering real public assets, with Bitcoin serving as the speculative vehicle to generate the capital.
Man, this paints a picture where Bitcoin isn't this separate pure tech thing at all. It's deeply embedded in and potentially manipulated by existing power structures and financial interests.
That's a consistent theme in the sources. Bitcoin has human governance, human hierarchies, human controllers, despite the tech. And they argue the governance is deeply flawed and untrustworthy, especially from the perspective of traditional finance professionals looking at it.
And this control extends to information itself. You mentioned censorship earlier.
Yeah, they call it an information war. The narrative around Bitcoin, especially the scaling debates back around 2014, was heavily censored, they claim. Critics were marginalized.
So the store of value narrative won, partly because dissent was suppressed.
That's the argument, that the dissidents who wanted it to be cash lost the narrative battle.
And this connects to Steve Patterson's wider work about information quality generally.
It does. They reference his Substack, Our Present Dark Age. His view is that the awful information quality in crypto isn't unique. He sees it everywhere: economics, health advice like the food pyramid, science,
Up to the Canadian.
money, massive funding steering research, narratives, entire systems. He theorizes we're in a dark age of managed information, a problem that got entrenched maybe a century ago, with state funding used to control knowledge. A hijacking of everything, not just Bitcoin.
And they mentioned Tim Wu's idea, the master switch.
Right, that pattern. New tech starts open and decentralized, flourishes, then gets centralized and controlled. Radio, movies, telephone, internet. The sources suggest Bitcoin might just be the latest example.
And the ultimate irony they point out
Is that Bitcoin, this public ledger, combined with KYC exchanges where most people access it, has become potentially a regulator's best case scenario. Perfect for tracking who owns what and who sends what to whom.
So the tool for freedom becomes a tool for control.
The potential is there, they argue. The dystopian control network is almost here, ironically built on Bitcoin's rails.
Okay, given this pretty bleak picture from the sources, what do they offer as alternatives or paths forward? Is there any hope for the original vision?
Well, they obviously point back to Bitcoin Cash, BCH, the fork that tried to keep the low-fee peer-to-peer cash idea alive. They even mentioned Gavin Andresen, who Satoshi apparently handed the keys to, saw BCH as the real successor.
And BCH has other features too.
Yeah, they note it has smart contracts, better scaling than Ethereum, apparently.
What about privacy? If Bitcoin on exchanges is a surveillance tool.
Good point. They mentioned privacy coins trying to be real digital cash. Monero comes up as the most popular. Also something called Zano, similar tech aiming for more scale and base layer privacy.
But Monero often gets delisted from exchanges, right?
Exactly. And the sources kind of wryly suggest maybe that's because it works too well at providing privacy. The projects that genuinely empower people financially, they imply, are the ones that get banned.
So the advice is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Be ready to move.
Pretty much. A multi-coin approach. Be flexible. Recognize that projects can get captured or derailed. Don't just buy one narrative. They do credit Bitcoin, though, for onboarding people to crypto in the first place, making it easier now to switch between different coins.
The sources frame this whole thing as a real fight, don't they?
Yeah, like financial Armageddon, a battle between creating real decentralized money, free from hidden control, versus these systems of, well, they call it plunder capitalism.
Is there any chance the establishment players pushing the digital gold narrative could be wrong? Could they get caught out?
The sources hold out that possibility, that if enough people realize the alleged manipulation or the lack of utility, maybe the big players, the Michael Saylors who think Bitcoin won't compete with the dollar, maybe they get left holding the bag if confidence collapses.
Okay, one last really crucial point related to the sources themselves, the timing of Roger Ver's arrest.
Right. This came up strongly in the interview. The timing is highlighted as deeply suspicious. Ver was arrested less than a month after hijacking Bitcoin became publicly available.
On tax charges from 2014, 10 years ago.
Exactly. Related to him renouncing his U.S. citizenship, the sources call the process skipping normal civil tax disputes straight to criminal charges and extradition unheard of and ridiculous.
They see it as retaliation, a hit job.
That's the language used. They suggest it looks like an attempt to take down someone already unpopular with the government for renouncing citizenship, maybe timed specifically because of the book.
How could the book trigger that?
Yeah. The argument presented is that the book, by exposing the inflation bug vulnerabilities, the governance issues, the alleged manipulation, it makes that whole strategic reserve plan, which might rely on unquestioned supply or even counterfeit Bitcoin, much harder to pull off smoothly. The book potentially throws a wrench in the works. So the arrest, coming right after the book's release, is viewed by the sources as possibly being directly connected, punishing the messenger, perhaps?
So wrapping this up, we've gone through a lot. This deep dive into hijacking Bitcoin and the Patterson-Fitz interview paints a really stark picture, a huge contrast between Bitcoin's original promise and what these sources claim is its current reality.
Yeah, a reality allegedly shaped by technical limitations used strategically, by censorship, by financial interests, maybe even geopolitical maneuvering through things like tether and potential reserves.
We've looked at the alleged mechanisms, the block size debate, the inflation bugs challenging the 21 million cap, the concerns around ETFs and custodianship, and this disturbing picture of a strategic reserve, possibly funded by pension savings, to facilitate a land grab.
It forces you to confront some very uncomfortable possibilities about control and manipulation in the crypto space.
Absolutely. So thinking about this history of alleged hijacking, the potential for manipulation these sources describe, this ongoing battle for control over the tech and the narrative, it leaves you with a big question. How much trust should you really place in any single digital currency, especially when access is increasingly through centralized platforms?
And what does all this mean for the future of financial freedom, or even just finding reliable information if we really are in what these sources call a dark age of managed narratives?
A lot to think about. What stands out most to you from this challenging perspective we've unpacked today?